talking about eye gaze in our presentation with Micah, Jackson, Kylie, Jocelyn, and Maya. First off, we're going to talk about the eye contact importance. And eye contact plays an important role in any social interaction. A lot of people take eye contact in many different ways. Sometimes it can be like disrespected or like you understand someone where they're coming from. And you literally can say a whole bunch through eye contact and the way you move them. Um, People use others' eye movements to regulate conversations, to make judgments, like I said, and to gain insight to like the more mental process internally. So today we're going to tell you about the two studies that we looked into, and the first study, which is called the eye contact perception in the West and East. It's a cross cultural study between the two cultures of Finnish and Japanese. The hypothesis through that article was that the Finnish participants should be less biased than the Japanese, considering like adverted gazes being directed at them. And then, like, another prediction was that Finnish participants would be less biased in considering the turn away gazes from Finnish faces to be directed at them than gazes from the Japanese faces. You'll all see all the more detailed studies on that within the presentation. Article 2 is going to be on the cultures of Canadian, Trinidadian, and Japanese, and that one is called Cultural Display Rules Drive Eye Gaze During Thinking. So, this one, the hypothesis was on where they think the three cultures would move their eyes when they are asked a question, and it all depends on whether they know the answer or they don't know the answer. And then there's also another hypothesis of thinking about the answer or a question and like where their eyes move about. And so then you'll then see that later on as well.
So now I will be discussing the control group that was used in Article 1. So there was no listed control group in this study. All 60 participants participated with the treatment. There were some control measures that the administrators of this experiment used. So they used the autism spectrum quotient test to see if the participants had any predisposed social disorders that could affect how they responded. Also, they used the social phobia scale, and both of these tests were identical, but they were just translated into different languages. So, moving on to the sample size, there were 60 total participants, 30 were Finnish and 30 were Japanese. There were 5 Finnish males, 6 Japanese males, and there were 25 Finnish females and 24 Japanese females. All of these participants were above the age of 18. They were all college students, and there was no difference in chronological age between the two groups. So, moving on to the assignment of subjects, all participants were asked to use technology and decide whether the face was making eye contact or if there was no eye contact at all. The subjects used the computer, and a picture would flash on the screen for a very short period of time, and he or she would have a few seconds to decide if the picture was making eye contact or not. Each participant would look at 16 pictures and decide if the faces were looking at them or if they were not looking at them. So now I'm going to talk about the different variables in this experiment. So the independent variables were the faces being shown on the computer and how long the pictures were shown to the participants. The dependent variables were how long it took the participants to respond and deciding whether or not the person in the picture was looking at them. And the controlled variables were they had to take practice trials before any data was taken so that they were comfortable with the way the experiment was ran. So they didn't mess up the clicking or anything like that. Um, and they could get good evidence in a timely manner. And all photos that were taken or used had the same gazes. They were calculated in degrees, and also they took the glare off of the photos using Photoshop so that the participants would all see the same image.
Several variables were found in Article 1. The independent was the faces being shown on the computer and how long the pictures were shown to the participants. So the flash was only shown for like 0.1 second, while the non-emotion face was shown for like a second. The dependent variable was how long it took the participants to respond to each picture and to decide if the picture was looking at them or not. And the controlled variables were the participants had a few practice trials before any data was taken, so this allowed them to get used to the keys that they had to use. And then all the photos taken and used had the same gazes, so they had the same angle that they were looking at if they were not looking at the camera. There were several subsections for the results of the study. So the first section was the looking at me responses. So Japanese found that there was a higher proportion of the looking at me responses and the Finnish faces. And the Finnish gave more looking at me responses to the Japanese and their own culture. And the cultural background of stimulus faces had no effect on the Japanese participants. And the rating of subject pleasantness and arousal. So, one thing that was big was that Japanese tended to rate the Finnish faces as more aroused than their own kind, and there was significant cultural background of stimulus faces and the participants, which would result in the next one, which was that the Japanese had more arousal feeling with the Finnish faces. And the emotion-wise, Japanese rated more neutral faces as more emotional than the Finnish participants. And overall, they found that cultural differences in eye contact perception between Finnish and Japanese participants, and the Finnish participants were more likely to consider a slightly averted gaze as directly at them when viewing Japanese than when viewing their own. And the Finnish demonstrated more eye contact in their daily lives than the Japanese, so this led to better eye contact discrimination for the faces of their own culture. And it is possible that cultural differences in facial emotion perception also contribute to the biases in eye contact perception. So, if just looking at their whole face rather than just their eyes. And we believe that this data could be replicated because there were so many factors that could be played and so many factors to be looked at. And there are actually websites out there that use this kind of technique with the computer, the flashing of faces, and using a keyboard to and react to the different kinds of faces. There's actually one, if you never did it before, it tells you whether you're culturally biased or not. So it'll tell you if you're more white biased or not. And there is evidence of peer review. So this was a part of another study by the local ethics committee of the Kyoto University Grad School and Faculty of Medicine, and the academic editor was listed as that name and went to Harvard Medical School. and the anecdotal evidence. So there were several limitations. Two of them, which were the last two, they were actually found in the article. So one of them was that they only used 8 faces of Japanese and 8 Finnish. So they could have used people of all races to see if there was a pattern of recognition or non-recognition of eye contact. Another limiting factor, according to the article, was using the Eastern and Western cultures. So it could be more beneficial to use more cultures than just 2, like the one above. So having Finnish react to Japanese and Russian, and having Japanese react to Finnish and Chinese. So having like an in group and an out group and seeing how they react. And then a last limitation the article described was recording the eye movement and gaze direction of each participant as they look at the picture. And then this could be looked at and decide if cultural difference impacts the eye contact perception and see where their gaze goes when the picture flashes on the screen.
So now we will go into Article 2, which was the cultural display rules drive eye gaze during thinking. So part of this study was the control group, which consisted of 3 ethnicities, Canadian, Trinidadian, and Japanese. All the individuals were treated the same. They were all right-handed, which is important because that is their dominant side. And all of them lived their entire lives in their country. So not only were they a certain ethnicity, but they grew up in that culture, which also plays an important role to the study. So the sample size was 30 total, and it was split up very evenly. There was 5 males and 5 females of each ethnicity, resulting in 10 Canadians, 10 Trinidadians, and 10 Japanese, and they were all around the age of 20 years old. So they lived the same amount of years. So the assignment of the subjects was that they were all asked the exact same questions, however in different orders, and there was 10 think questions and 10 no questions, and they were all the same, so they all got the exact same information, and they were all recorded in the exact same room, so the setup was the same too, where the video was, where the questionnaire person was, and where the subject was. And they were all interviewed by a woman of their specific ethnicity, just to make them feel more comfortable. So the controlled variables, the independent variable were the questions being asked. The dependent variables were the eye gaze when thinking, the time it took them to answer the question, and of course whether or not they actually answered the question correctly. This plays a big part because although they were looking specifically for the eye gaze of what each person did, the eye contact, and where their eyes went when they were thinking of the answer, it played a big part whether they knew it or not, in order to look back and see where their eyes went. So if they didn't know it, did they go to the left or to the right, up or down, all of that. And then the controlled variable were obviously all the questions that were asked were all the same, and the questionnaire person had to follow all the same procedures of eye contact, even if that is not typically what they would do in that culture, just so that everything was the exact same. And next, Michael will dive in further.
In the results section of this, they took what was done in the study, which the eye gaze was tracked from the beginning of when the question was first asked all the way until when the question was answered, the time in between, and where the eye contact went or the eye gaze went during that time. And so each country, eye contact, this was direct eye contact, was significantly higher for the no questions than for the think questions. So people looked all over the place more for when they were thinking about the questions rather than when they knew the questions right away. And an ANOVA was run for that, and so the no questions, the median was 69% versus the think questions, the median was 42%. And then through that, Trinidadians maintained significantly more eye contact than Canadians or Japanese when it came to the no questions. And there was no significant difference between each country for the think questions, and there was a t-test run for that. They only had one table provided, and I thought it laid out everything that they were trying to talk about well. And so if you look at the no questions versus the think questions, you can see the direct eye contact percent average medians, and then the standard deviations of it, and then the gaze up versus the gaze down. And you can look across and see what the Canadians' averages were, or medians were, the Trinidadians and the Japanese. And so through that, they saw that Japanese had a strong downward gaze bias, especially for the no questions. They would have this tendency to look down, which I'll talk about more in a second. And Canadians and Trinidadians had a strong upward gaze bias, so they were kind of looking upwards when they were thinking. And then in their conclusions of the results, they said that Trinidadians and Canadians made the most direct eye contact when they knew the answers. So 88% for Trinidadians and 64% for Canadians, but had no bias directionally when they didn't know the answer right away. Even though it did mention that for the think questions, they tended to look up more when thinking about the questions. There was no true bias after a t-test was run for that. And the Japanese made 54% direct eye contact when they knew the answer, and had a downward bias with the with eye contact or with their eye gaze, because too much eye contact is seen as disrespectful in their culture. So downward gaze is seen as more respectful. So they're more of a submissive culture. And so that's when, with eye contact, it's seen as a respect thing. As far as information for replication, I thought that the method section really outlined what they did well, specifically for the materials and procedures. And so through that, like, they asked 20 questions that were total, and 10 were think questions. So this consisted of 4 verbal, 3 spatial, and 3 mathematical. And one of the examples is, if a car is traveling at 90 kilometers an hour, how far will it travel in an hour and a half? And then there were 10 no questions, or these were also considered memory retrieval questions. And it's like, oh, what color is the sky? So it's like basic questions, and it's easy for people to make up questions like that and monitor it. They also did this as far as scoring. They outlined what scoring looked like, and so they monitored gaze and said, okay, upward gaze is between this degree out of 360 because of your circle of your eye. And so this degree to this degree would be upward, and then this degree and this degree would be median, or the middle, horizontal direct eye contact, and then this one to this one would be downward. They also measured left and right as well. So it's easy for people to replicate in the future because they outline that really, really well. As far as peer review goes, this was listed in the author's note up at the beginning of the article, and the reviews were done by Sylvia Haynes, which mentioned that she worked for Queen's University in Canada. But I couldn't find anything on Robin Hanbury and Laura Moat, but they were mentioned as a credible reviewers, so I'm assuming they have high credibility in this area. This study was also funded and granted from the National Institute of Child Health and Development, Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, Japan Society for the Promotion of Science, and 21st Century Center of Excellence program. So they had high credible foundations granting them and helping them through that. So they went through a very formal process in getting funded for this study. As far as anecdotal evidence, like I said, the study only had one table, and so I kind of got lost in all the numbers that they wrote out, and so that can be confusing. So if it was a little more organized, that would help. They also only used 3 ethnic groups to represent the study, and I meant to say 2 were from the Western Hemisphere and 1 was from the Eastern, so Canada and Trinidad versus Japan. And So this only like covers a few cultural norms for some people. And so if they could have had representations from Europe, Africa, um, South America, and even more Central America, that could help with their study because there's different cultural groups and you can see the eye gaze. And so I think that would benefit the study in the long term. Other than that, I thought it was a solid um, study and it was very informative.
The results of the two articles were very different based on what was studied and examined. For Article 1, we saw in the end that there was a cultural differences as to the Finnish having a slight turn-away gaze when looking at Japanese faces than when viewing Finnish faces, whereas there was no effect to the Japanese when viewing the Finnish and Japanese faces. They maintained the same. Um, and then as for Article 2, between the three cultures, when asked a question, the Trinidadians maintained the most eye contact out of the three when they knew the answer to the question, whereas the Japanese maintained the least eye contact. And for the thinking part of the study, the Canadian and Trinidadians looked up when thinking, as to when the Japanese were thinking, they looked down. And this is all very important because the studies give us some insight to different cultures, and this is why it is so important to like know about it. For example, if Cornerstone was to take a group on a mission trip and we come across a culture, for example, the Japanese culture, we come across someone in that culture and they're thinking of a question and they start looking away from you or looking down. To us, sometimes that would probably seem disrespectful, but to them, it's a normal. So we can't get offended and just like get mad and walk away. We have to understand like that's their culture and that's what they do. So it's very important for us to know and just study all these different little features in different cultures and know um, why it is so important. And that's pretty much all. And these studies helped a lot because they give a lot of information, and that's about it. Thank you.